So let me introduce you first, Rob. You're one of the founders of Ethical Consumer. And you're going to be chatting to us about what needs to happen, what we need to agitate for change on. And we've also got Sara Edmonds. Hello, Sara.
Hi.
Sara is Director of Studio, do I pronounce this as Search?
Yeah.
Studio Search. She's also an architect, retrofit advocate and activist. So, I think, Rob, we're going to start with you, if that's all right.
Yeah, go.
Yeah, so there's a microphone down there. So Rob is going to kind of do a bit of going to do some slides for us, and then me and Sara are going to have more of a chat as well. As I say, we're talking what needs to change, what do we need to agitate for change on.
At what point do I need to pretend to be Colin, or shall I just start doing it? Shall I start with Ethical Consumer?
Well, you can start wherever you want, but I do need to introduce you properly first, though, before you actually get going. So, as I was saying, you are one of the founders of Ethical Consumer. In 1988 you found that, but you now work on projects from food to electronics, specialising in ethics in the banking and investment sector. You're a writer and an editor. Your most recent book was published in autumn 2021. It's called The Handbook of Ethical Purchasing Principles and Practice. And you want to get organisations to explore changing their corporate forms to ones that better address the interests of multiple stakeholder groups.
Okie dokie. I think I'll probably try and do this without slides, but I might, like in the middle, think, oh, a picture would be quite useful here. Ethical Consumer, I'm kind of assuming that most people have heard of Ethical Consumer. The Venn diagram, if you draw a Venn diagram between Ecology Building Society and Ethical Consumer, they almost overlap those circles. Everyone, historically has come from very much the same place, and we've worked with you guys for 20, 30 years now doing all sorts of stuff like this. It's been a fantastic experience. We started off publishing, and so we kind of use we're activist publishers. So how do we agitate for positive change? We use publishing and information as a lever for positive change. And our main specialty, if you like, has been naming and shaming bad corporations. In that lots of other people won't do it because it's quite scary and you get sued and this kind of stuff. But we've made it a specialist subject of ours to be certain enough of what we're saying in order to kind of name and shame the problem corporations.
Have you ever been sued? Sorry, I just need to ask you about this.
No one has successfully sued us. Although we did once retract a statement and make an apology where we knew we were right, but we would have risked the whole show against a giant multinational US corporation. So, it's a tricky game to play, but we were here 40 years later, still doing it. Because although it's important that we're all sitting here doing the right thing in our lives and making sure our own carbon is right, there's a lot of bad stuff out there, and that needs calling out and that needs challenging, because if we don't do that, that's just going to carry on too. And this is particularly around oil at the moment, and this is probably going to be a focus of what I'll talk about here, and carbon and oil and carbon are becoming. We're in the kind of fourth decade of Ethical Consumer now, and we took a political decision at the beginning of the last decade to just focus quite a lot of time on carbon. So we're developing lots of specialty around analysing corporate statements around carbon to see if they're bullshit, and because there's a lot of net zero out there, but it's very, very technically hard to spot whether it's decent or not. And one of the things that we do is we publish, for people who don't know Ethical Consumer, we publish kind of league tables of companies in most product areas, with the most ethical at the top and the least ethical at the bottom. And that's proved, and the theory of change around that is some people will go, oh, I'm going to buy from that one instead. So in a sense, we're trying to move people economically by they're going, I don't want to buy from this company, I want to buy from this company. But there are lots of other ways that we've discovered that creates change, in that companies themselves just want to move up the list, and they get on the phone and say, how do I go from there to there? And so some of it is about teaching companies what good practice looks like, because often they don't know. And there are all sorts of other things like that. So that's where we started. We kind of moved also into in a similar way, we now advise companies and charities on their own supply chains, because sometimes they're really big purchasers, like some of the companies that we work with have £1 million contracts with companies, and if we're ethically screening their suppliers down, you can see change happen quite quickly, because they will actually change their practices overnight to do that. So we're looking at purchasing supply chains. We also, on the research side, we've started working with companies themselves are becoming increasingly, upset about the state of the world. They're not all oil companies, they're not all terrible. And like Ecology Building Society is we were at dinner last night and someone described it as a campaign group with a financial services arm stuck in the I think it was probably after a beer or two, so it would be quite funny. But we work with quite a lot of other companies whose directors are genuinely passionate about change, and they need research and they need information in order to drive their own lobbying efforts. And so we do, and so that's another way of creating change through research and information. The third one that I just want to spend a moment on is around, is very specifically around special projects. So we discovered, around research and publishing, you can just kind of create really kind of weighty reports and stick it in the public domain, and with questions that people need to answer. And we did one a couple of weeks ago on supply chains into southern Spain for workers' rights amongst migrant communities that pick up all vegetables. And that's the BBC are sending people out there now, and the Guardian's running it, and there are meetings with lots of supermarkets. So that's another way of creating change. You use research to explain how bad things are, and you ask people questions that they're forced to answer, difficult questions that they're forced to answer. So the special project side, and the one I taking a long time to get here, is around a special report that we've done called Climate Gap, where we look at the impact of UK consumers from year to year and go, well, we've got net zero as a target as the UK, and consumption emissions, are they moving at the right pace in line with the target? And unsurprisingly, you'll find that they're not. And this is largely because we've had a government of climate deniers in charge for the last 5 years, and but that report is that there are a number of things that report is trying to do. It's got advice for the government on it doesn't currently measure consumption emissions. If you look at how consumer emissions go and the net zero target of the UK, you look at your housing, which we've all talked about here, you look at your transport, you look at your food, but any imported goods, they don't look at as part of the stuff here. So any consumer things you buy, like phones or computers and all this stuff, this isn't part of our net zero strategy. And we have masses of imported stuff. So some of the stuff so the reason we've taken ownership of this consumer impact space is partly to influence government with kind of sensible comments like that. Partly it's to situate, this is a complicated one, so the idea of individual action alongside the government and business action that needs to take place. There's been an interesting discussion in the last probably 3 or 4 years around something they call the responsibilisation of the consumer. It's all art. If only we didn't have giant houses or fly planes and do all this kind of stuff, it would be great. It's all the fault of us, if you see what I mean. When actually, now academics have fully pulled that apart and realised how ridiculous it is. And actually, so much of the choice that we make as individuals is defined by the circumstances around us. The fact that it costs you 70 times as much to fly somewhere, to go on a train somewhere as it does to fly. All the kind of bonkers things out there in the environment that we have to make. So one of the things that we wanted to do was situate the things that consumers have needed to do alongside the things that governments and companies needed to do. Partly so that consumers didn't feel that they were solely responsible for this, and so that we could see the transition that needs to be made, having activities from all these people. And so we because there's something about motivation about doing stuff. And I think if people who are doing stuff on their own and can't see other people doing it, think, why am I bothering doing this? All these people are flying, why am I bothering to think about all this stuff? So it's about having a sense that we're all in this together and travelling in the same place, but we need to locate government, company and consumer in that. So we have this really complicated report called Climate Gap Report. Fortunately, when we needed a sponsor for this, we originally did it with the Consumers Association and Which, but it got a bit politically hot for them, and we were looking around for a new sponsor, and we found a sponsor in the Ecology Building Society, which was great. So I want to kind of thank everyone here for picking up that report. And one of the reasons that it was getting a bit hot for some of the other people that we approached is that after the first report, everyone ignored all the stuff that we were saying about how it's all consumer action is part of something else, and they just kind of listed the top 10 things consumers should do and didn't read what it is that we wanted them to read, if you see what I mean. And so the second time round, we put in a much more detailed analysis of what. So we decided to try and offer advice to consumers around political action that they could take as well. So it's not just about, it's like about choices of the teas and coffees you buy, but it's the choices of the campaign groups you try and sign up to and what you do. And in order to do that, we looked at, we had this we have this great bar chart that I won't show there, but it said, you ask climate specialists, as an individual, what's the balance between minimising my own emissions and getting involved in political action? What should we do now? And they say it's about 60-40 towards political action. It's actually more important now for us as individuals to be taking political action than minimising our own emissions, because the situation has got so poor. And so because of this, we're beginning, we look at climate impacts under different headings, and we list campaigns that we think are worthwhile under very specific headings, and amongst those headings. And this ranges from everything from supporting 0 hour, which is the bill in Parliament, which is setting a big, it's forcing the government to set targets across everything in a coherent way. So a big system change at the top, down through specific lobbying exercises, and down to direct action at the bottom. And so we are recommending to consider going on XR demonstrations, because we think, frankly, we need to be doing this stuff. And if I wasn't here today, I would probably be in London doing that stuff. And thinking, I love this thing, I can't go to the big. So actually, there are lots of people in London kind of doing stuff right now on a list of things we've done. I don't think there are many other sponsors that would allow us to actually publish something saying, go on an XR demonstration, take direct action. And this is something that the Ecology Building Society has been able to do for this very specific piece of work that we think is super important. There's more detail about it. It's called the Climate Gap Report and Ethical Consumer and Ecology Building Society.
Brilliant, thank you. I will come back to you and ask you just about the other stuff in a minute, but thank you for that one. That was really, really, really interesting. Just before we move on to Sarah, let me ask you, you said that you've done that big analysis of corporate statements, the kind of, in terms of greenwashing. What percentage did you come back to say that actually corporate statements on climate action bear no relation to reality, do you think?
I would say something in the region of 90%. And this is because, essentially when you're looking at managing your climate impacts, you have this thing called Scope 3, which is your supply chain. And actually this is where the majority of impacts happen. And companies are only just starting to learn how to measure this stuff 2 or 3 years ago. And so they're really they're basically making lots of estimates to fill in for it at the moment, and that's not a way to manage a solution to a problem.
No, that message has come so strongly from all the panels, the importance of making sure that the data and the facts and the information is there. I think it's come through from almost everyone who's been talking this afternoon.
And Ecology this year, I think is it just this year, has started publishing the impact of its own mortgage lending, which is the kind of Scope 3 for the finance sector, which we were super pleased to see. So that's becoming best
Don't
practice.
ecology come at the top of the list, does it?
I think it does on. I think it does in mortgage lending, but not necessarily on some of the borrowing stuff. Still, there's some specialist borrowers that do it there.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Right, so moving on swiftly. I'll come back and ask some questions in a minute. But Sara, if I could come to you at this point. You're the Director of Studio Search. You're an architect, a retrofit advocate and an activist. As I say, you're Director of Studio Search, which is a consultancy that advocates for systemic change around low-carbon domestic retrofit. The focus of your work very much is to drive that change in the built environment, and you want to also drive it in communities through connecting bottom-up grassroots projects with the top-down initiatives. So let me ask you what do you think needs to happen? And what do we need to agitate for change?
We need to dismantle capitalism, frankly.
Okay, just a little thing.
It does come down to everything that we do. I'll tell you who I am in a second, but I think this is just get straight into it. We can talk about doing things. We can talk about making corporate statements. We can talk about what coffee we buy, what coffee we don't buy, whether we're vegan, all of the rest of it. If it's not within a very different looking structure, then we are just making and repeating the mistakes that have gotten us into this mess. So it's really important to understand what is the landscape that you're operating within. So what I mean by that is we can trace the climate emergency back through colonialism, but you can go back further and work out where was the split in societies that made one society think it was okay to pillage and destroy, and another to be more around stewardship of the planet and the environment that you're in. So I think it's really important to continue to ask the questions, and that doesn't mean stop and navel gaze and worry about it and think about it. It's about iterative unlearning. So we have to practice and learn to fail quickly where we can. There's obviously some places that you don't want to fail quickly. But there are things that we have to do, and we have to test, and we have to try, and we have to challenge the system all the time, particularly holding our politicians to account. So one of the other things that I do is I'm steering group co-ordinator at the Architects Climate Action Network. And we are a volunteer organisation with anywhere from sort of 5,000 to 10,000 active people, however you look at that. And we are a network of individuals across built environment related professions taking action to address the twin crises of climate and ecological breakdown. That's an organisation that's been going for about 3.5 years, and that actually was dreamt up on the bridge, Waterloo Bridge in London, climate protests, September 2019, where just a small group of architects, and I was not one of those, were sitting on the bridge and looking around at the city and thinking, my God, what have we done? Look at all of this carbon, look at all of these buildings, and how are we treating them? And what are we doing replicating? What are we doing building more of it? Because the planet is a finite system. It's one really finely balanced finite system, and everything that we do is connected back into that. So you've got to develop systems thinking. Systems thinking is what a lot of people talked about today. Systems thinking, and understanding that you are a part of that, and every decision that you make and every way that you use your agency has an impact. And I think we all also need to remember that we have more power than we've been told we have. So individuals have much more power than they've been told they have, and we can really realise the agency of our power as communities when we come together, which has been shown here. So there's a broad range of things. There's other things that I'm involved in as well. Many jobs like yourself. I did once introduce myself at an event as a slasher. Nothing sort of too violent in that. I just simply meant an activist slash architect slash pacifier designer slash, and that is sort of about trying to learn very quickly and work out how can we pull all the strands together. How can we pull it all together? Because we do need all of it. There is no one solution. There's no one size fits all in all of this. We need all of it. And that's the innovation that I think Marianne and Lynn and other panellists earlier were talking about. It's that innovation in sort of understanding we need to challenge the systems. We know the technical stuff will follow, but there is no silver bullet, so we just need to, I could go on for a long time. I'm going to stop talking.
Let me ask you a really, really tough question then, in what you've just said there. So you said there is no one solution. You said really we need to destroy capitalism right at the start. But kind of somewhere between that, if I had to say to you, and the potential, especially given what Rob was saying there about kind of political activism now becomes more important than individual consumer choices. If I had to say one or two things that we need to be agitating on, what are they for you?
So I actually said dismantle capitalism, and there is a little difference in that, because what we do need to do, I mean, yeah, I'm all for destroying it, but frankly, if we destroyed it now, we would be in a chaos state, more so than we are now. And that opens the door for transition. When we, everybody knows the phrases, the just transition, the green transition, what does that mean? Also net zero, what does that mean? I think Marianne, put it perfectly. Climate doesn't care whether we're talking about net or gross or whatever. We got some balancing to do. I think there's huge amounts of models out there about how you can do that. We need to do something that's called becoming growth agnostic. Okay, so it doesn't mean that you have to be anti-growth or pro-growth or anything. Just be growth agnostic. Whether we grow as an economy is sort of by the by. We need to focus what we're measuring society by, and that's sort of thriving communities. It's access. So I bet. All right, who here knows about Kate Rayburn?
I was going to say you sound
and
like
economics.
You
I know, preaching to the converted here.
She very much does say growth.
She does, yeah, and she talks. And actually, each time you read that book, you kind of come across new revelations, which is, you've got to decouple the fact from the idea of that we can still make money and keep money in our systems to keep us all afloat, to operate within the systems that we do need to participate in. So dismantling capitalism doesn't necessarily mean throwing all your money away and going and living in a tent which I'm up for, frankly. But it does mean not being focused on that money being used as an end for growth of individual wealth. That's something that we don't need. The gentleman talked earlier on about what I think you were talking about was radical sufficiency. What do we actually need? And when we question those things, I think we need to change the language in how we talk about all of this, because it can tend to be a bit, you got to give that up, you got to put that down, you can't have that, you can't have this. It's all sort of glum and, oh, jeepers, what am I going to end up with? There's a flip side to that story, and that's the story we need to be pressing as a narrative. So what's the opportunity in this change? What is the opportunity? Because there are many, so many opportunities, and we're hearing some of those through the speakers today.
Yeah, I would just say, if anybody doesn't know donut economics and co-growth, it's definitely worth having a read. It's a different way of looking at economics. She's an economist, so she comes at it from that perspective. But the whole conversation around GDP growth and things is very different, I think, when you look at it. And she does talk about the positive things that we will get from this.
Yeah, it's reimagining a future. And just simply, for those who don't know what donut economics is, we all know that, exponential growth, that curve, right? That's the economy that we know now. But actually, the donut is two concentric rings, and the lower one represents the social foundation that, humanity need not fall below. And the outer ring is the planetary boundaries that we really cannot shoot past. And then when you realise that there are those two barriers, the space between them is the space that we all get to thrive as humanity within that system. Jesus, who wouldn't want that? Do you know, you ask yourself, what are you holding on so tightly for to this notion of growth going where? Through what ceiling exactly? Why wouldn't you want the other? And this is where the power of communities matter, that all of you, I can imagine that, you talked about the Venn diagram of ecology and consumer. I bet you're all part of different organisations that overlap, and there's all sorts of community strength that wraps between everything. And what 10 to 12 years of austerity and more has done is make that invisible, because it's not talked about. The power that sits within communities is not the stories that the Murdoch press wants to promote. Did I get a little political there? But, you've got good stories to tell, and we have a job to tell them, because who wouldn't want to be part of what you're doing? you know.
Thank you. Before we go to some questions, I just want to come to you, Rob, with some specifics as well. Tell me if I've got this wrong, but if Colin had been here, just very quickly, some of the things we picked up that we thought he would talk about, very specific things. Some stuff around divestment, particularly in fossil fuels, things around stopping funding hate and hate activity, and also looking at something called ESG, environmental, social, governance investing. So could you just put some of those ideas very, very quickly out there for us?
The reason that I said I can do Colin's is because we work with Colin a little bit on a couple of other things, and so there's another Venn diagram where Colin and his work are kind of quite similar to the work that we all see here. So Colin's is kind of what we now know as an ESG specialist. ESG is environmental, social and governance investment. So it's about how, you know, big capital markets are now talking about what us older folk in the room once knew as ethical investment, and then became SRI, responsible investment, and then became SRI, socially responsible investment. Now it's become known as ESG investing. And it's becoming embedded in the mainstream capital markets in the world. And it's gone from, so it's in boom time, it's having a rise, and this is why we want to talk about it here. And it's partly in boom time because the world's in crisis, and actually the investors are beginning to realise that there's money to be lost here as well as to be made. Particularly, you know, the notion that there's sort of stranded oil being stranded assets. So if oil companies are describing their assets as all the oil that's in the ground that we can't burn, actually they're worth nothing like what you're trading them as. So the traders are beginning to understand how the transition of thinking is going to affect their long-term value that they're holding. And so, and Colin is an activist, particularly working in ESG around divestment, and so he's mainly involved in putting together campaigns to stand up at Shell AGMs and go, we're not going to approve your net zero strategy because it's bollocks. And we, possibly on a more technical basis than that, but so we're doing him down here. But and so he's part of building coalition, particularly amongst big pension funds. So big pension funds particularly need to know what the value of their stuff is going to be in 40 years' time. Lots of investment is only interested in the next 3 months, but pension funds need to be long-term investors. So they're big allies there. He's also working with student communities. Students like to get their universities to divest from oil and gas, and we're beginning to see them across the UK. I think Cambridge has done quite a lot. So there's big. So actually, people are moving out of oil and gas, which by some measures is 30% of the entire value of the economy around. So it's a really big move for these guys to divest, and the divestment discussion is really complicated. However, I guess, and so one of the things he was going to talk about is the rise and the impact of ESG, and just around the impact, I always kind of, in campaigning, you always know you're having an impact when people start fighting back, if you see what I mean. And one of the things that we've observed this year is that in the States particularly, the right-wing states that basically support oil and gas have started to try to make ESG decision-making around investments in that state illegal. So they're trying to ban ethical investment, as it were, in that state, because the impact of it is beginning to affect oil and gas's opportunity to raise the capital that it needs to build more wells. So it's beginning to have an impact. There's nothing like enough. But as I say, when you see them fighting back, you can see that's going to have some impact. So that's mainly what Colin's been working on, ESG. I would just mention one other thing here. And in the context, you asked the question of what are the two most important things that we should be acting on. And I'd say carbon is the first one, which is why we've talked about it before. The second one, I'd probably, this is, I'm going to get to Colin in a bit, but ethical consumer, we're really concerned about tech and its impact on speech and the politics around us. So discourse, public discourse, what's happened to that and the ability to tell lies and for them not to be called out, and has been decimating our political institutions really. And one of the most alarming things, just in the short term, around that is hate speech, effectively around, particularly around minorities and refugees and migrants. So particularly anti-migrant hate speech. And Colin sits on the board of something called Stop Funding Hate, which you may or may not know about, which used kind of consumer pressure. It was one of the most successful boycott campaigns of the 2010s, in order to get advertisers to pull advertising from news outlets that were promoting hate speech, very specifically the Daily Mail at the time, but also the Express and the Sun. And they actually had, and it was so successful with most of the supermarkets and the money brands coming from it that they actually had to, they've reformed their speech. You couldn't tell it necessarily at the moment. That's partly because most of the hate speech is coming from the government at the top. All they're doing is reporting it at the moment, which is a bit of a problem. So trying to use consumer pressure, our pressure campaigning, to try to address those problems that have gone on, that have been created in human discourse, really, by tech and by profit-seeking tech, particularly. So the Stop Funding Hate model really, really is successful, and it's now being rolled out. Lots of communities are being taught about how to use the language that is done.
Thanks.
Yeah,
thank you. Great, we've just got about 10 minutes left. So, who would... Person at the back.
Me? Yeah. In my experience, one of the biggest stumbling blocks is what I call economic illiteracy. It exists, I think, at 3 levels. It exists certainly at the political and journalistic level. It exists even worse, I think, at the academic level. I much admire the work of the students in Manchester here, who a few years ago set up the Post-Crash Economic Society, and subsequently produced a wonderful book called The Econocracy. And it's readable and so on, but it's changed very little in the content of the orthodox economic courses. And I just think, I doubt if the ethical consumer has the time to do anything about it, but a ranking of university economics departments would make very interesting. How close the course is to the real world as distinct from mathematical manipulation. Oh, one final thing. Nice to see you, Rob. We last met in Oxford in 2015.
My eyesight was good enough. Here you were. Not as young as I was.
I mean, it's interesting you should say that. Kate Rayworth, I sound like a bit of a Kate Rayworth groupie, I know, but I do love data economics. I love her writing, I love listening to her. She talks a lot about that. I mean, that's how she kind of came into this, and she's an expert economist herself, and she was looking at economics in universities and saying that there is absolutely no discussion about alternatives, and also about questioning the right, not even just the moral rights or wrongs, but actually the efficacy of using GDP growth as the sole determiner of economic success or otherwise. And she talks a lot about the fact that there is very little discussion, and that people can leave with an economics degree and not actually even have had those debates.
And journalism gives us the idea that economic growth and the government that can deliver it is doing the right thing. Look at this trust in the autumn of last year.
I'll just make one. I don't know. If I've started reading this book called Post Growth by Tim Jackson. If you don't know it, it's possibly better than Kate Rawls, but which possibly is sacrilege in this room. But if you don't know it, have a look at it. It's super important in that space, and a great piece of work.
Let's have another question. You had your hand up, didn't you? Yeah.
My name is Sim, I live in Housing College. I want to talk about ecology, sustainability, and it's not my fault, I missed the ACAN this morning, but I was looking at the annual report and I couldn't quite tell these mortgages, because many other people didn't get this, but reading the annual report, it kind of looks like it's both of them. Yeah, that.
Louise is the chair. Louise, can I hand over to you to answer that? Is that all right?
It's over 200 million. How it works is most of our assets are our mortgages. So for a building society, mortgages are assets because that's money that we have lent out to somebody else. So it's our money, we're lending it out, and it produces us income through the interest we charge. And as a building society, because that's what building societies do, we lend out on mortgages, in other words, secured loans on residential property. So most of our balance sheet, most of the asset side of our balance sheet is mortgages. And that's what we've been partly hearing about this afternoon, is some of the projects that have been made possible by the lending we do. Oh, sorry, it was your...
No, I was just going to actually mention ACAN's connection to ecology, because it sort of stands to, well, who else would back up something that we're sort of towing a fine line? And
This is the Architects Climate
Action Network, yeah. Can I flick on can I just put on a slide? Just this one, it's a photo, it's not loads of text.
We've got 3 minutes left.
Oh yeah, there we go.
Oh, there we go.
That's when ACAN was formed. This is kind of activities that ACAN participate in, which can be deemed radical sometimes and not at all radical in other ways. And then the other slide, that one, this was a campaign that we ran, which involved collaborating with the Great Homes Upgrading the New Economics Foundations campaign, where we held a parliamentary action ahead of the spring budget to call for a national retrofit strategy, and here I'm handing the letter to Rishi Sunak's aide, the then Treasurer. So it looks like quite protesty, quite active stuff, but we went to COP26 and we applied to be in the green zone, and like many organisations who are actually doing the work, didn't get a look in. We went to COP anyway, and we hired a venue, and we were looking for some sponsors, and Ecology picked up the tab for hiring the venue for us in COP, which facilitated 4 days of events that brought together people who crunch the numbers and do the data and challenge the systems and do all of that. So really, that's been a really foundational thing for us, and I don't know many other organisations who will do that, and it's given us the confidence to put our head above the parapet and look for funding beyond that, and that's what's starting to happen. So it's a real sea change moment for us as an organisation.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, that's one of the things about the COPs, is that actually what goes on outside I've been lucky enough to work at, not the last one, but the previous 6 COPs, with an economic think tank, and that is the work that goes on outside is just as important, and someone might say even as important, given how much the deals have moved us forward. That's me being a bit cynical, isn't it? One last question there.
It's an architectural question, I think. It seems to me there's nothing in the planning and building regulations to promote efficiency of buildings. I've just been involved in a neighbour dispute where we're knocking the house to bits. And when you get the planning consultation from your local council, there are a list of reasons that have nothing to do with it. There are a list of reasons that are still in planning, and in neither list does it mention anything to do with improving the performance of the building. And it seems, and when the building inspector comes along, all he's bothered about is whether the building's going to fall down.
Building regulations are like the bare legal minimum. Like, we're not at all doing great work there. In fact, Lynn and Marianne were talking about standards and the Passive House Trust and actually making buildings resilient. Building regulations are frankly just not fit for purpose at all. But also, embodied carbon is not regulated in the built environment, and the construction industry, as you will all know, is responsible for 40% of total emissions, right? But it's not regulated at all. And one of the campaigns that the Embodied Carbon group we've been campaigning for regulating embodied carbon in Parliament, and working with another group called Part Z who are doing the same thing to try and actually agitate for change politically as well. So we're using our individual agency, but we're also trying to do that in a way that can affect changes of the parameters and things that we work with as an industry. So you're quite right, like there's a lot of the systems that aren't really working and are a little bit confused and not really pushing at the right place.
Let's just take one last question at the back.
You say about push-pull economics, and I think that's one thing that's really pushed the old eco retrofit will probably be this heating crisis, and because I actually think I've got to do something about my home, but that's okay getting more retrofitting, but the thing is, what is the value of that in society? We now see a lot of solar panels. I can remember when we'd see one on the roof, but now that's sort of like socially accepted. But it needs to be in the same, it needs to be recognised at the estate agents, because people will not retrofit because they don't know if they're going to have to move for a job, get divorced, or anything that happens in life. That forever home was planned to be their forever home, but it might not be. If they have to move and they've spent 60,000 on retrofit, are they going to get that back on the brochure when they sell the house? That's the push-pull of it, until it's recognised out there the true value of it. And I think the price of electricity has made people stop and think, but it's that's what's pushed it. But it is all the systems like planning, but you do need to see it on the brochure at the estate agent, and then people take it seriously.
I'll just briefly answer this. I think this is a really good point, right? Because what we're doing is we're looking at the system of, I mean, the housing system in the country generally is problematic at best. And we're looking at retrofit, at least it has been looked at on a very unitary basis within systems and structures that we're already using. You know, okay, there are 29 million homes, 28 million homes, however many million homes. And we're all thinking, how are we going to retrofit each one? How are we going to do that one and that one and that one? And what's the payback and all the rest of it? But you got to park all of that, frankly. Like, it's not going to be delivered at scale, at pace, on a unitary level. It's got to be done in a much more collective level, right? So People Power Retrofit and Carbon Co-op is a great model of trying to embed those values within a community, so that there's sort of this additional community wealth that's built, and yes, retrofit is part of that, but it's also bigger questions around what we value and how we value our homes. Do we value our homes as assets to make us money, or do we value our homes as places where we can live and thrive and care and love and all of that? Like, where's the shift in that? And I know that's not a direct answer to should it be. There are mechanisms like happening, like people mentioned, building passports, and also whether or not the works stick with the building the whole way through, and sort of we make EPCs fit for purpose so that they're actually telling us something and that the data is right. But if we're going to have, we need to have really honest conversations about the things. You know, the industry knows that we don't have, this is to quote Indy Johar of Dakota Labs, we don't have the hydrocarbon credits to mine all the materials to do all the retrofits. We can't. So if we can't, and if we don't have that, what then? Because like Marilyn said again, so I keep coming back to you, you made a good point. What then? What are we going to do? What is the opportunity? You know, we've got to be really honest, and we've got to try and find those sort of collective solutions and really question, what are we building into? Is this what we want as a future? Is this serving us, you know, and the planet?
Thank you. And would you just like to say your last thing to everyone?
I'd say my last thing, because the Climate Gap report looks at consumer impacts across food, housing, transport and consumer goods, we have a slightly different perspective. We're very housing related in this room. And and housing is the most depressing of all the four areas in terms of progress. So on a kind of, you know, a more uplifting note to go away on is actually that around food, transition away from meat and dairy-based diets is moving faster than people predicted and faster than it needs to predict, and that's mainly driven by young people. The transport shifts are looking much better. I mean, they're kind of meeting their goals, mainly due to electrification, which has a lot of electric cars have a lot of problems, but actually they're sort of more, they're less off target than the housing target, because the electrification of transport has kind of been worked out and how it's going to work. And around consumer goods, and this is one of the things that the Ecology Building Society stuff paid for, was our survey of recycling and reuse rates around consumer products. Gone up massively over the last 2 or 3 years. So actually the throughput of consumer goods is just slowing down, and that's partly because there are better, websites to buy all this stuff second-hand that makes life much easier. But the actual rate the rate of deconsumption in the consumer goods area is also going faster than people expected. So it's not all a disaster, but the work that Ecology does here in housing, is part of a bigger thing. It's great that we're doing this stuff because, God, it needs to move.
Well, thank you for that, because that does end us on a positive note, which is absolutely brilliant. So thank you for that. Can you say thank you to Sara?